Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to rise in the House today on behalf of all the residents of my riding who have reached out to my office and spoken to me personally about their dissatisfaction with the first budget of this Liberal government. Following the release of the budget, my office sent out surveys to every household and business in my riding, asking whether or not they support the out-of-control spending of this Liberal government. Out of the responses I've received, over 90% of my constituents do not support these ballooning deficits and unnecessary spending. Canadians know best that you need to live within your means and take out loans or increase spending only in urgent situations. There will always be emergencies that require extraordinary measures: a major roof repair, a new pump in a rural water system, or the replacement of a car that died without warning. But, Mr. Speaker, while most Canadians would agree that these might be good reasons to borrow, I doubt that many would consider it good money management to take out a new loan to pave the driveway or buy a new flat-screen TV, especially if you're already paying down on a hefty mortgage. Along with many members on this side of the House, this is my first budget while sitting in opposition, and Mr. Speaker, I'm not impressed with this government has already started to tear down the hard work that our Conservative government did to build a strong economy that Canada enjoyed, and neither are my constituents. While Liberals talk about slow growth in the past, they fail to recognize that Canada led the G7 in economic growth through some of the most challenging times the world has seen since the Great Depression. Mr. Speaker, the current government won't even admit that we left them with a surplus of over $7 billion. The Department of Finance, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and experts across Canada repeatedly remind them that they are wrong, but they simply continue to ignore the facts. This is important because the almost $30 billion that they've decided to borrow is borrowed not out of necessity, but out of a desire to take the hard-earned money made by Canadians and spend it on pet projects for special interest groups. And they've made sure that they can continue this out-of-control spending by including in their omnibus budget bill a clause that repeals our balanced budget legislation. This balanced budget legislation, passed by the previous Parliament, would force future governments to restrict spending. So we are not borrowing on the backs of our future generations, and that we can incrementally pay down our national debt. But the Liberals are now removing the hope we had of reducing our debt, and instead they plan to increase it by another $119 billion. Mr. Speaker, many of us in this House have been blessed with children, and some of us even with grandchildren. I am blessed with 9 grandchildren, but these out-of-control spending budgets accumulated over time will gravely affect them. And I want to make sure that the Liberals know that there will be consequences to their poor decisions today. If you consider just debt charges alone over the course of this government's mandate, interest charges alone increased by almost $10 billion. This is money that could be spent on more important infrastructure projects, increased health transfers. It could also be spent on funding a small business tax cut or fulfilling the Liberal government's promise to increase home care spending and invest in palliative care. Yet there's not $1 earmarked in this budget for palliative care or increased home care. So over the next 5 years, the interest cost alone rises from $25.7 billion to $35.5 billion. That's an increase of almost $10 billion just to pay interest on the increased national debt. The 3 topics that have been brought to my attention most often by my constituents are: first, the Liberals' broken promise to lower small business tax rate; second, giving hardworking farmers a cold shoulder; and third, no money given towards increasing access to palliative care for Canadians. First, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' broken promises to small businesses. Waterloo Region is home to thousands of small businesses, and they were all excited to hear that every single party in the campaign was going to lower the small business tax rate to 9%. Unfortunately, this promise, like many other promises made by the Liberal government, was completely broken in their very first budget. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Small Business and Tourism from the Waterloo Region herself has been defending this broken promise throughout the region and across Canada for the past number of weeks. The Finance Department had estimated that this broken promise will cost the small business sector $2.2 billion over 4 years. It is clear that when it really comes down to it, Liberals fail to understand the crucial role that small business has to play in Canada. One has to wonder if the entire Liberal government agrees with the Prime Minister, who stated publicly that small businesses are just tax havens for the wealthy. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister really is out of touch with Canadians. We know that roughly 2/3 of small and medium-sized business owners fall directly into the middle class. Employers are about 4 times more likely to be earning less than $40,000 than they are to be earning more than $250,000. On top of the broken promise of lowering the tax rate for small business owners know that you don't keep on spending money you don't have and are very worried about the direction this government is going. Speaking on behalf of these small business owners, President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Dan Kelly, says, quote, "Small business owners across the country are deeply troubled by the ballooning deficit. What was promised to Canadians as a short-term $10 billion deficit plan to invest in critical infrastructure is now $29 billion with no plan to get back to balance. Small business owners know that today's deficits are tomorrow's taxes." End quote. Second, Mr. Speaker, this budget is a complete disaster for all the farmers in my riding. Growing up on a farm myself, I have a pretty good idea of the amount of work that these men and women put in every day to feed their families and thousands of other families across Canada. These are the people we should be supporting, but this budget completely forgets about them. In fact, the only support for agriculture industry in Canada is extra funding for bureaucrats in Ottawa. None for moms and dads who are up before sunrise and finish work well after it sets. In my riding, where there are over 1,200 farms, approximately 1,400 in all of Waterloo Region, accounting for $473 million in gross receipts in 2010, farmers are professionals. They want to meet their social obligations in protecting the environment, in protecting the health of their animals, and providing the best quality products for their families, for their communities, and for the world. The Canadian agriculture and agri-food sectors account for more than $100 billion in economic activity every year and employ more than 2 million Canadians. The importance of agriculture to our national interests cannot be overstated. In fact, 1 in 8 jobs in Canada depend on agriculture, those in primary agriculture, food processing, horticulture, and farm markets. Under the previous Conservative government, farming families saw their taxes drop to the lowest level in 50 years, and farmers gained access to more international markets than ever. But today, with this budget, Canadian farm families are being left behind. The Liberals are borrowing $30 billion to spend in other sectors. The Liberal government must make our farm families a priority. Third, Mr. Speaker, is this government's failure to meet their commitment to increasing home care and palliative care. As we in this chamber are considering Bill C-14, it is now more important than ever that this government make good on its promise to increase funding for home care and palliative care services. I have said it many times already during second reading of Bill C-14, but let me repeat, Mr. Speaker. Without proper palliative care options to give Canadians considering assisted suicide, they are not making a fully informed decision. We have all failed in protecting vulnerable Canadians. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that this Liberal government make 4 changes to this budget immediately, as it is in the best interest of all Canadians. First, they need to limit the size of their deficit and re-implement the balanced budget legislation that our government introduced. They need to start realizing the money they are spending is not theirs to spend without reserve, but it is taxpayers' money and it belongs to them. Second, the government should make good on its promise to lower the small business tax rate. This would be one of the single best methods to help out the middle class and to grow our economy. These businesses will be able to expand and innovate and hire more workers, immediately helping our economy. Third, the Liberals should rekindle their relationship with Canadian farmers and immediately include measures in this budget that would lower taxes on these hard-working Canadians who are the heart of our country. Last, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government needs to provide funding for home and palliative care across Canada. We know that over 70% of Canadians who need this form of care do not have access to it, and this is something that absolutely needs to be changed. Now more than ever, we need to protect and care for the most vulnerable among us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Laurentide-Labelle.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member calls about deficits in the economy, and in fact, it's been about 10 years rather since the Conservatives were in power, and they left us poorer and more indebted than when they arrived. They attacked supply management, something we defend. They didn't invest in most of the programs that my colleague is speaking about today, and in fact, they're saying we should cut more, invest less, but only if it doesn't cause more debt. If we listen to the mandate, if he could redo the mandate from 2006, what would he do differently now?
Mr. Speaker, the big difference between what we did in Conservative government in terms of investing in the future was we invested in infrastructure projects that will actually improve our economy. We're not investing in program spending. We weren't investing in niche market things like CBC or other things that are not going to increase our economy at all. So, Mr. Speaker, while the Liberals talk today about the fact that we increased the deficit, when we went into deficit spending to inject into the economy, they actually wanted us to spend more, and now they're saying we didn't spend enough. And yet we've increased the deficit too much. So, Mr. Speaker, they're talking out of both sides, and you can't have it both ways.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering, the member should provide some clarity on the issue of deficits. The member knows full well that under the former Conservative government, they had $150 billion of debt added to the taxpayer or the future taxpayer. When they inherited the power back in 2006, they were provided a multi-billion-dollar surplus, and they turned it into a deficit of billions of dollars. Why should a Liberal government take advice from a government from the previous government that failed so miserably in terms of managing the finances of our country, Mr. Speaker? It makes no sense. The recommendations that the member is putting forward in terms of supporting the family farm, think about it. A tax break to Canada's middle class that's very real, and this member and his colleagues are voting against the tax cut. They're voting against the enrichment of the child benefit program. That's all going to put hundreds of millions of dollars in our communities in every region, including the prairie farms and farms all over Canada. Why would he oppose that? Why did he support the Conservative massive deficit?
The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'm voting against, Mr. Speaker, is found on page 234 of the budget. And if members would just look at the figures, when you look at the public debt charges alone, between 2015 and 2020, they rise from $25.7 billion to $35.5 billion. That's virtually a $10 billion increase in deficit, in debt charges alone. That's got nothing to, that isn't even talking about starting to pay down the debt. And Mr. Speaker, only a Liberal would say that paying down $40 billion of our national debt when we first came to office in the first 2 years is somehow squandering the surplus. The fact, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservative government injected money into the economy and then came back out and had a balanced budget at the end of their mandate is a crucial difference from what we see here with a continuing plan to deficit after deficit with no plan to pay it down at the end of their mandate. And Mr. Speaker, they clearly promised in the platform maximum $10 billion deficit per year, and at the end of a 4-year mandate, back to balanced budget. We are nowhere close to that, and Mr. Speaker, Canadians know it. Constituents of my riding are not happy about the fact that we are spending money today that my children and grandchildren are going to need to pay back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaires.